The Great Western Invasion of the Mongol Empire from 1236 to 1242, conquering the lands of what is now Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and culminating in Hungary and Eastern Europe, is one of the most famous campaigns of the Mongol Empire. Equally famous is the mysterious Mongol withdrawal from Europe in 1242. Popularly, this is associated with the death of Ögedai Khan in 1241. Now, in the normal explanation, the princes all learn of Ögedai's death, and as a result, they all have to rush back to Mongolia to elect the next Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Except, this is not what happened. Most of the princes, when they withdrew, did not even return to Mongolia, but stopped on the Volga River. The next election of the Great Khan was not held until 1246, and when we look at the historical sources, we do not see a hurried rush to escape Hungary, but a methodical and careful campaign looting whatever they hadn't destroyed in their first pass over Hungary. For decades now, scholarship has produced a number of alternative explanations, and today we are briefly going to examine some of these explanations, and in the end offer a new explanation, courtesy of Dr. Stephen Pow.
Thanks a lot for having me, Jack, as always.
I'm glad you can make it. Stephen has looked at the Mongol retreat from Hungary, and in fact the Mongol invasion of Europe now, for several years. Longtime viewers of my channel might recognize his work from his very well-researched article on the death of Zev Noyan, or Jebe Noyan, and he has continued to explore this disconnection between a lot of popular imagery of the Mongol Empire compared to the historical sources. Our video today is going to be a brief look over the existing theories in the scholarship, as well as Stephen's own theory. Over the next couple days, though, we'll be releasing an extended version of our discussion, which you can listen to in various parts, with the full thing being released at the end of this week, whenever that ends up being. So if you like this and want to hear more of it, be sure to subscribe or something. Now, Stephen, would you like to talk a bit more about this categorization of the theories?
Yes, I just want to say that viewers should also hit the bell button. So now that we've got that cleared up, there's been just a lot of explanations for the Mongol withdrawal from Europe. It's a very weird event. In 1242, the Mongols had come crashing into Europe, defeated all these armies, and they withdrew. And historians have never really come to a total agreement on what happened. For decades now, the scholarship has produced a number of alternative explanations, and so I just added mine to the pile, but went a bit further, I hope, than past attempts. What's interesting is by the 1990s, a historian in the United States, Greg S. Rogers, had noticed that there's so many theories, almost as many as there are historians, but they all kind of fall into a few big categories. For instance, there's a kind of political theories, there's theories that the environment of Europe was not suitable for the Mongols, so they left. And then there's some theories that the military weakness of the Mongols, or the strength of the Europeans supposedly, drove the Mongols away. These are older theories, they tend to be. But the one thing you're most likely to see is that the death of Ögedai Khan, the son of Chinggis Khan, famous Chinggis Khan, saved Europe from destruction. This is probably what you're going to see if you just open any general book on the Mongols.
Ögedai was the Great Khan of the Mongol Empire from 1229 until his death in December 1241. In fact, we know the exact date of Ögedai's death. The 11th of December was when his body was found after a particularly heavy night of drinking and feasting. Now, the explanation of Ögedai's death being the cause of the withdrawal is simple and to the point. That Ögedai died, his body was found, messengers ran across the Mongol Empire to recall all of the various armies so that they could return to Mongolia in order to elect the next Great Khan. Now, we pointed out a couple problems with this right at the start of this discussion. A very important point that very few people have actually considered is, could this message from Mongolia have reached Hungary by the time the army withdrew in 1242? Now, Stephen has provided some very persuasive evidence against that fact.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been possible for Mongol messengers to travel from Mongolia to Hungary in that short time frame. Looking at travel times recorded across the northern route, as it was called, across Asia and Europe, it's just not possible. Asian and European traders and diplomats, they recorded certain standard times that it took to move across this Mongol Yam route, it was called, like the postal station route. And that amount of time that these traders and diplomats record doesn't match the few short months available for this event to have supposedly happened. From December 11th, when the Khan died, to at the very first days of April at the latest. The data from the Middle Ages doesn't support that this is possible.
Stephen has offered a very persuasive calculation that I think argues against the fact of this message having reached Hungary by the time the Mongols began to withdraw at the end of March 1242 or the start of April 1242. Essentially, that's about 110 days for it to have come from Mongolia to Hungary. Now, the Mongols, of course, were impressive riders, but this is pushing the grounds of feasibility.
Yeah, and another question is, would it be in the interest of the new leaders of Mongolia, of the Mongol Empire, to immediately send messengers and alert the massive Mongol armies under Batu in Hungary and on the frontier of Austria, to alert them that the Khan had died? And I don't think they would have wanted that information to travel. They would have tried to delay it, because Batu was very dangerous to the agenda unfolding in Mongolia, led by the new Dowager Empress Toragene, the widow of Ögedai. She wanted her eldest son, Goyak, to succeed to the throne. So news could have gotten out involuntarily. Even if they tried to suppress the news of the Khan's death, maybe some secret message could have got out. But you can imagine there would have been a delay, because Ögedai Khan didn't die in a big capital city like Karakorum. He died in a hunting camp, in an isolated, deserted area that's now a national park in southern Mongolia. And that would have helped keep this information secret for a while. Just like when Stalin died in the 1950s. It's a different empire, of course, the Soviet Union, but this is a useful comparison. Stalin died in his dacha, this out in the countryside. He didn't die in the Kremlin or something. And that helped his sidekicks to keep a secret of his death for some days. And this might be a useful comparison.
If this message did not leave Mongolia immediately on the day of Ögedai's death, that leaves even less time for the message to have reached Hungary before the army began to withdraw in the spring of 1242.
That's right.
A pretty much impossible feat, even more difficult to achieve. Toragene wanted her son Guyuk safe in Karakorum and in position to take the throne, and she did not need an army under a potential rival princes to be there at the same time and possibly contest the election. As it stands, Toragene did not actually succeed in getting her son elected until 1246, and possibly may have not even begun the process for the election until as late as 1243, judging from some of the movements of Subutai and other princes in Batu's army.
Yeah, so the general picture that's emerging then, that maybe Batu's army in Europe didn't even know about Ögedai's death when they withdrew from Europe, is something that's actually supported in the sources from the time. We have a Mongolian report translated into Persian and in Rashid ad-Din's chronicle from around the year 1300, but it's based on a source from the time of the Mongol invasion of Europe that says the Mongols did not know the Khan was dead when they withdrew. And European sources don't have that insider viewpoint, but they do support that picture. A prisoner of the Mongols in Hungary, Rogerius, Master Rogerius, was a prisoner during the withdrawal, and he says that the Mongols moved very slowly and leisurely out of Europe. There's no sense that they were rushing back to Mongolia for an election. And when you take the European and Asian sources together, they create the picture of a withdrawal that didn't even go straight back to Mongolia. It went into the Balkans, south towards Constantinople. And then they kind of moved out of Bulgaria And just like you said, it fits the picture that the Mongol leaders in Europe did not know the Khan was dead in 1242, March or April.
Now, it should be said, the probable origin of the Ögedai's death causes withdrawal from Europe is not, in fact, just a modern extrapolation, though, because there is a papal embassy to the Mongol Empire from 1246, headed by John de Plano Carpini, which actually makes this connection in the first place. Probably much of this is Plano Carpini simply doing the math, essentially, that from his point of view, Ögedai dies just before the Mongol withdrawal begins, and therefore that is the explanation for the withdrawal. He may even have been told that. He is told a considerable amount of information by the Mongols, and it may have suited them to put the blame onto Ögedai's death. However, Plano Carpini and his mission are the only ones who even suggest that this was the explanation for the withdrawal. When we look at sources outside of Plano Carpini, it actually in fact seems to indicate that the political explanation, that is, that Ögedai's death caused the Mongol withdrawal in spring 1242, is in fact demonstrably false. The sources do not support such a conclusion. The simple fact of the distance required to have traveled in the dead of winter in 1242 does not support a message having reached them, and it does not seem that the political leadership in Mongolia would have allowed such a message to have left immediately upon the finding of Ögedai's body. Now, the political theory has not been without its detractors in the scholarship for quite some time. In the last couple decades, a number of scholars have tried to propose alternative explanations, many of them having noted the same failings of the political theory we have just listed above, which leads us to our second category of this discussion, the environmental theory. That is, that there was some sort of environmental or ecological factor which caused the Mongols to leave Hungary in the spring of 1242. However, Stephen has demonstrated that the evidence for this is likewise on rather shaky ground.
These environmental theories, it's sort of like how plots have a man versus man, or man versus himself, or man versus nature. The environmental theories broadly are the Mongols versus nature. And they suggest that the environment, weather, the climate, this was the deciding factor in whether or not the Mongols took Europe. And part of the reason that this alternative theory is popular is probably because of the larger trend nowadays with concern about the environment, climate change, natural resource management, and all of this stuff is very poignant and very pertinent today. So these kind of theories now seem to be getting more traction for what happened in Hungary and in Europe in 1242. The theory started with a Hungarian scholar, no less, at the University of Indiana, Dennis Sinor. He wrote an article in 1972, and he continued to argue his environmental theory for 4 decades. He started with a good point, that Batu never returned to Mongolia to choose a new Khan, but the problem is that the precise data he used to prove his theory just changed wildly over those 4 decades, until about the year 2000. Like how much grass a horse needs, how much grass Hungary can provide for animals, how many horses a Mongol soldier needed. All of these variables, he changed them over time to arrive at these low numbers, like 60 to 80,000 soldiers total could be in Hungary.
This theory also relied on the assumption that the Pannonian Basin, the grasslands in the Kingdom of Hungary, the exclusive staging ground for the Mongol army, that the Mongols would not use any other sources of subsistence for their horses. But this is a rather silly thing. The Mongols just travel all the way across Asia. All they have to do to get more grassland for their armies is to cross the Carpathians east or south, and you're in the grasslands in Dobruja and modern Romania, or a bit further south. You're in the rich grasslands of the Great Steppe, where we know they were staging troops and horses. For the Mongols, it's not just you arrive in Hungary and you stop there. They're thinking on more international scale. So the fact that they would care about the restrictions of the Hungarian grassland, if they even were capable of making that calculation in the time they were there, seems frankly ludicrous. And in fact, we have plenty of examples of the Mongols not caring about the carrying capacity of a given region. Only in summer 1231, a couple years before this campaign, during the final campaign against the Jin dynasty, Tolui, the number 2 prince of the empire, the younger brother of Ögedai Han, and his army were stationed in the Qinling Mountains in northern Shanxi in China. There were so little supplies there that the army is supposed to have resorted to cannibalism to survive. If the Mongols were willing to station an army in barren mountain ranges, it's doubtful the considerations of a relatively rich grassland like that they would have found in the Hungarian kingdom would have been an issue for them.
Yes. So that's probably why this theory hasn't gained total acceptance, Sinor's environmental theory. But in recent times, with our deeper concern with environmental catastrophes, climate change, 2 prominent scholars, Ulf Bunken and Nicola de Cosmo, came up with this notion that they found evidence from paleoclimatic proxy data that there had been an unusually cold and wet period in the winter of 1241-1242. So the spring of 1242 was wet in the Carpathian Basin. It was cold and abnormally compared to other years. And they thought this drove the Mongols away. And this theory has caught some attention nowadays. Some researchers accept it, some disagree. But I disagree along with colleagues in Hungary. And there's a good reason for that, I think. It's because this explanation of what the short-term precipitation would do to the Hungary soil is not well reflected. Hungary rarely had famines, even in the Middle Ages, without fertilizer, without modern technology. Just very rarely did Hungary have famines. And I mean after like huge rains that flooded gigantic areas. Because Hungary just had really good soil. 1100s German crusader who passed through Hungary said Hungary was sort of a Garden of Eden. And the sources don't say, this is the most important thing, the medieval documents don't say that the Mongols in Hungary and in Europe were affected by famine. They never say this. The Hungarian peasants faced famine. The prisoners were denied food, like sheep, by the Mongols, and were only given the sheep's head near the end of the campaign. But that does not support that the Mongols were starving. That's a totally different thing. And the Mongols' animals starving from a lack of grass is different from humans starving. So saying that the Hungarian peasants were starving, we have documented evidence of that in 1242-43 because they weren't able to plant, because the Mongols were there and would kill people out in the fields. So they were all hiding and they weren't able to do the harvest. The Mongols took the harvest, parts of it, and the rest was left to rot or destroyed. So this doesn't prove that the animals were starving. Even if there was unusual weather in 1242, it just doesn't prove that and there's no documentation that the horses were starving, for instance, that the Mongol animals were dying, and that the Mongols were dying. And also, something you know very well, Jack, from your coverage of the entire history of the Mongol Empire is just how the Mongols overcame so many different challenging environments, like those mountains in Shanxi you just mentioned.
And in fact, the sources are very explicit when environment does play a role on the outcome of a Mongolian campaign. And this is why your argument about the fact that sources don't mention this in regards to Hungary is, I think, very powerful. In fact, we have an example to compare to Hungary. Hungary in 1285, when Tolbuca Khan of the Golden Horde and the important prince of the Golden Horde, Nogai, invaded the Hungarian kingdom, or during their withdrawal from Hungary over the Carpathian Mountains. They were caught in a horrific snowstorm, and most of Tolbuca's army was lost through starvation and exposure. In another example from 1301, the powerful Khan of the Ilkhanites, Ghazan, invaded Syria. This is a couple months after his great victory at Wadi al-Khaznadar. And in this campaign, heavy rains turning the roads to mud is specifically mentioned as forcing Ghazan's army to withdraw. So the sources don't have a problem mentioning these things. The fact that they aren't mentioning this in 1242 indicates that they did not see these scenarios as significant. Now, it is not to say that Bunkin and de Cosma's calculations are incorrect. They very much are, or as far as we can tell. But they were not significant in determining the outcome of the campaign. So, moving past political and environmental concerns, that is leaving us with military. That is, did the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary occur because of, well, military weakness? Were the Mongols beaten in the field?
And, these kind of theories exist, these military explanations of maybe the Mongols were defeated, etc. But these theories haven't been around until I started writing things related to this. These theories have not really been popular since before World War II. In Eastern Europe, they continued after World War II, but there's always this belief, really in the last 60-odd years amongst historians, that these kind of theories can be hijacked into nationalist rhetoric or reduced to a matter of some unique quality of European military structures and systems that just wasn't there.
Some special feature inherent to Europe, that European heavy cavalry was too much for the Mongols, or castles themselves were just terrified the Mongols. But the Mongols had successes against all sorts of fortifications and all sorts of cavalry and armed forces across singularly much more powerful states than anything they would have faced in Europe. Of course, the examples par excellence, the Jin dynasty and the Song dynasty. In their experiences with any state before 1240, the Mongols did not encounter any individual military aspect that caused them to withdraw. Yet, still, they turned back in Europe. So what might be the case here? A popular source of argumentation is what were the goals of the campaign. And essentially, scholars have tried to explain the Mongol withdrawal in 1242 as intentional from the outset, that it was never intended to go further. So we see this, for example, with Timothy May's tsunami strategy, that the Mongols would strike first in a region, devastate it, and then withdraw after softening up the enemy and then returning to complete the conquest later on. Or that it was a limited goals, that the Mongols never intended on going any further west than they did in 1241. That there was no idea of conquering Hungary further on. Or that they left in 1242 as they achieved what they had set out. They'd only come to punish the Cumans who had fled into Hungary, and having done that, there was no reason to pursue. Or one that's gained some traction in recent years is that it was not worth it. That they saw Europe as too poor, too useless, nothing of interest there that they wanted, and therefore there's no point pressing on.
Yeah, even if that theory hasn't been written about in detail, it's a widespread idea that Europe really had nothing to offer the Mongols. One of my master's degree supervisor is a sinologist, and if you focus on medieval China and the wealth of it that Marco Polo talked about, you might think, well, what did Europe have? It was a backwater. It was off in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it just wasn't worth it to the Mongols. And this is a widespread idea, despite that you might not find it in every book. Now,
of course, it should be said the wealth of a region was never a precursor to whether the Mongols attacked it or not. We have, for instance, in the reports of John de Plano Carpini, of extensive Mongol campaigns against the peoples in what's now northern Siberia, for instance, the Samyids, and apparently going all the way up to the Arctic, to what is now Russia's Arctic coastline. Now, you can't really argue about the wealth of that region compared to what is in Europe or China. And we know that the Mongols tended to prize heavily European metalworking and textiles, but the Mongols believed the entirety of the world was supposed to fall under their control. This was the will of heaven, and the Mongols were very convinced they had to carry this out.
Modern historians often assume that if the Mongols wanted something, they got it. And so if they didn't conquer an area, modern historians say, well, it's because they didn't want to conquer at that time. That's why they didn't. Perfect example of this is the Great Raid, Subutai and Jebei's Great Raid in the early 1220s, where they went north of the Caucasus Mountains, they defeated the Georgians and many peoples, then the Kipchaks, then they defeated the Russians and the Kipchaks at the Battle of the Khalkha, and then they departed. And the notion is, well, they didn't want to conquer that area. They were just on a reconnaissance raid. So modern historians often do Mongol campaign apologetics.
Almost a sense of having to save the military reputation of the Mongols as if it needs saving. And it should be said, though, we know that the Mongols wanted to conquer Europe because they continued to send letters of submission to European monarchs and the Pope, and very much made the indication clear they thought they were going to conquer Europe. Güyü Khan, when he died in 1248, may have even been en route to recommence the campaigns in Europe. With that being noted, that the sources explicitly say the Mongols wanted to continue to campaign in Europe, we can dismiss claims that the Mongols had no further interest in Europe. So, with all that being said, what do the sources specifically say regarding the Mongol retreat from Europe in 1242? And this is what Stephen has really focused on in his research, and I think provided a very convincing theory as to why the Mongols abandoned the campaign. Or was it really an abandonment of the campaign?
Yeah, so when there's a lot of modern historians debating all these different theories, it's good to just go back to the primary sources and just look for a pattern. What do they have in common? And one thing that you see is that sometimes we read of the Mongols having Pyrrhic victories. Pyrrhic victory, of course, comes from Pyrrhus of Epirus, who invaded Italy and fought against the Romans, and he would win all the battles, but he would say, if I win another victory like that, I'm finished. And the Mongol victories in the Western campaign seem very hard fought. Chinggis Khan's son died in one, fought near Moscow, actually. So that's just a sign. That doesn't happen very often, that a Mongol prince of that level dies in combat. The accounts of the battles in Poland and Hungary seem very brutal, and this is on the European and the Asian documents. We'll see this same notion of hard fighting, unsatisfying results. In short, Pyrrhic victories, or even setbacks. And I just want to illustrate this with one point. It's the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, probably the single most important event of the whole European stage of this great conquest. In 1241, the Royal Army of Hungary fought and was defeated by the Mongols in eastern Hungary at Mohi. Now, if you go to three sources, I have an Armenian source here, I have a Mongolian translated into Chinese source, and I have a Italian papal source from a friar. And they're all describing this battle in a sense, and they all agree on something. Hetum, the Armenian, says that the Mongols returned mournfully from the borders of Germany, and never again did the Tartars invade Germany. Tartar, Mongol, same thing in these sources. So they returned to Russia and Cumania, and they never again invaded. The Yuanshi, a Mongol source, records that the princes wanted to withdraw from Europe. They were discouraged, and Subutai had to tell them not to withdraw. And finally, we have John of Plano Carpini, Italian emissary to Mongolia on behalf of the Pope, and he also records that the Mongols wanted to retreat at the Battle of Mohi. There was pandemonium, fleeing, and Batu eventually stopped this retreat. But there was a sense of fatalism and that they were going to die in Europe. Now, Western European, Armenian, and Mongolian sources, they're not all based on the same material. These are different people who weren't collaborating. Granted, Hetum was in Europe, but his account of the battle sounds very much like even Ethiopian, Egyptian sources about this campaign. They say the same thing. Or a person in Iraq says this, Bar Hebraeus. And how is it possible that they all match? That they all match on different aspects of the same event? And that they all say that the Mongols are on the verge of retreat, including the Mongolian source, from the highest level. So this is the one theory where you're going to find agreement between a wide range of sources. It's the only theory for the Mongol invasion of Europe. So if we go on the strength of the sources, this is probably where the truth is to be found.
The image that appears when you compare All of these accounts in both Europe and China, and written from a Mongolian point of view, and the Islamic world, usually written from a Mongolian point of view, but also written from outside of that. And when I say Mongolian point of view, I mean these are sources written usually on the order or by someone working for the regional Mongolian governments. The image that appears in all of these sources is that the fighting in the Western campaign, so that's including the campaigning in the Rus principalities against the Kipchaks and in Europe proper, that all of this fighting was difficult and that a great resistance was put up all along the way, and that it was difficult sieges, that great losses among the Mongol forces throughout, and that Mohi in particular is singled out by the Mongols as a great achievement, that it was a hugely, hugely hard fight, that there were significant losses in elite Mongol forces, that there was fear and concern among the Mongolian princes of continuing onwards, and that, in fact, a rout nearly occurred. Even the Battle of Liegnitz, often sort of dismissed as a sideshow in the campaign, in the invasion of Europe. When you look at the only detailed source on that battle, even there, it's pretty much even fighting until the Mongols pull out a trick at the end of the battle. The point we're emphasizing here is a much more realistic one than the popular image of the Mongols handily overrunning every single foe they came across. That this was hard fighting upon hard fighting over years and years of hard fighting.
And that's just it, the years. The Mongols are hoping for a blitzkrieg sort of victory. They want to come in and just overwhelm and shock and awe their enemy. And it worked to a point. But what happens is you've got these citadels everywhere. Like behind me, this image is actually the Nitra citadel. It's today's Slovakia. It was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. But Hungary, especially the western and northern parts of the kingdom, were dotted with these citadels, just like Nitra. Very impregnable kind of fortresses. And Slovakia was full of them. And sure enough, the Mongols had trouble. In Croatia, which is hilly and mountainous, they had a lot of trouble with the fortresses. In Slovakia, they had a lot of trouble. And they were heading more into that kind of territory. Hungary, Eastern Hungary is a nice flat plain and not good for castles. The situation changes dramatically at the borders of Germany. And this is where we read about the Mongols having more trouble as they push westward in 1242 against these fortresses. And so though, even if you say, well, they can conquer these fortresses, fine, they could starve the people out, but that takes a lot of time. And the Mongols have already been worn down 6 years of campaigns. They've traveled thousands of kilometers, fought hundreds of engagements, most of them unrecorded, but they've had difficult fights like the Battle of Mohi and Liegnitz. The castles would take too long to siege, and then we even read about them being denied the loot because the Europeans, when they realize a city's about to fall, like Esztergom, the capital of Hungary, the people inside burned all their valuable fabric to deny them and killed all their livestock to deny the Mongols things that would be valuable to the Mongols, particularly. And so it seems like they're being worn down. Batu is starting to doubt this campaign can even be achieved in his lifetime, probably, with the amount of places they're going to have to besiege. There's coastal units, there's navies. It's only going to get worse. And that's the situation. The fortresses would have been very demoralizing. I think they had a real military effect, but they also had a psychological impact. A Mongol commander would do the calculations and say, well, this is going to be not what we came equipped for. Sort of like Napoleon's army in Moscow as the winter was setting in 1812.
And in effect, it's a sense of frustration. The Mongols are still winning the battles, but it's taking too many losses to continue to win and too much time to go through all of these sieges. The army may have begun at a strength of perhaps 100 to 150,000. It depends on your estimates there. But we know part of the army left in 1240 to return to Mongolia. There would have been losses due to injuries, deaths. Some of the army was left behind to hold on to the recently taken territory in the Rus principalities and the western steppes. So the army that actually arrives in Eastern Europe in 1241 is maybe even half of its original strength. In short, the Mongols simply do not have the forces and the resources available to them in 1242 to continue to campaign. Now, something we do see in in most Mongol campaigns, in fact, is that the Mongols' preferred time for campaigning is autumn through the winter, and in withdrawing in the spring to rest their horses in the summer. We see this repeatedly in the campaigns against the Jin dynasty and in the Rus principalities. Those are both theaters where we see Subutai in particular carrying this out. The sedentary societies do not like to campaign in winter, so this is a boon to the Mongols. You can cross frozen rivers, take advantage of stored harvests, all of these things. When the Mongol army in Hungary begins to leave Europe, it may have begun to do the same thing. Return to steppe to rest its men and horses and essentially stop and reevaluate the situation. To either gather more men, get reinforcements, more resources, new tools for assaulting these fortifications in Europe. And essentially, they recognize they cannot complete the conquest of Europe in 1242. The Mongols had no problem with a prolonged conquest. They thought the conquest was inevitable. And to them, it was pointless to send all these men just to fight and go die for nothing. There was no point to wear the army down into nothing. So the army begins to withdraw in 1242, not to retreat to Mongolia or because of the environment or anything like that, but essentially as the campaign could no longer progress and they needed more forces and would presumably have planned to return to Europe soon after and continued fighting. If not, the resulting political fallout from Ögedai's death caught up the major princes of the army. And that seems to be the consequence of Ögedai's death. Not forcing the Mongol withdrawal, but preventing the Mongol return.
Maybe people would find this theory challenging, but I would say that the Mongols still had this interest in conquering Europe, but political developments and problems between the Mongol leaders ensured it didn't happen. So the Mongol conquest of Europe was sort of an unfinished project. It was started but never able to be finished, and a lot of that had to do with the Mongols themselves in Mongolia, what was happening to them. It wasn't anything to do with Europe. But this is all part of a dissertation I wrote called Conquest and Withdrawal, and I'm preparing it for publication as a book, and that should happen soon. The last 2 years, I don't know what happened, but I got sort of sidetracked somehow. If listeners today want to find out more and want to see the precise details, look forward to that book, Conquest and Withdrawal, which shall come out eventually. Or
read Stephen's recent chapter, Mongol Inroads into Hungary in the 13th Century, part of the edited volume, The Routledge Handbook of the Mongols and Central Eastern Europe. You can find a link to that below in the description, and you can see him discuss some of the evidence presented today in more detail. And over the next couple days, we will be discussing all of these points in considerable more detail, as well as the relevant sources and ideas, in expounding on each of them.
Yeah, and it's important to note that there really isn't a book on this topic yet. You have The Devil's Horseman, which is sort of generally about the invasion of Europe. But right now, I want to emphasize, and this is true, the best thing available to understand these events right now is the Jackmeister himself. His channel is bar none the best, furthest, deepest details you're going to get about this topic right now. And the Kings and Generals channel. The videos they're doing are a major service to the public, I think, because so far, really, there hasn't been a book that's available on the market yet that has gone into the kind of depth that you guys have gone into on this, reliably using the sources, no less.
Well, thank you. It means a lot to hear. Kings and Generals did not sponsor this video. That was from the heart. So,
but Boxu did.
if you would like to hear more about Stephen and I discussing even this topic, we did a talk on this on the Kings and Generals podcast, Ages of Conquest, I think last year or the year before, as well as I wrote a rather lengthy series about the Great Western Invasion of the Mongol Empire for that podcast. You can also find that out in the description below. And yes, again, we'll be releasing more on this in the next couple of days. So thank you for listening. If you made it this far, we'll have much more to say on it in the coming days. Thank you for coming, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
The Jackmeister. Just call me Jack, that's fine.